Today we are going to look at how to describe the graph of an equation y is equal to mx plus b. And before we can do that, the first question we need to ask ourselves is, how do you graph an equation? Kimberly, how do you graph an equation?
Well, I know that first you'd need to start out with an XY table of points.
You do need to start off with an xy table of points, but how do you make one?
You have to plug in some numbers for x and just go from there and find out what y is, and then put those in a table.
But how many of those points do you need to graph that? Michaela?
2, but it's better to have more.
Yes, 2, but it's always better to have more than 2 points once we start looking at the graph. So let's take a look at the graph. Now on your table, you would find an activity sheet. Y is equal to negative 1/2 x plus 1. Who would like to give me about 5 points that we can use as our input, our x value, so we can start graphing? How about you, Cassie?
Well, you could use -1, -2, 0, 1, and 2.
Excellent. So those are what we're going to use as our input. Now, what I would like you to do is to look at that graph, which is really activity A on your sheets, and you're going to work on working out the output, which is the value y. So I'm going to give you a few minutes while you do so. You have found out the output, the y value. I need you to graph those on your paper. Now that you've taken a look at the graphs, how would you describe the graph? How would you describe it?
It's a line.
It's a line.
It's a line. So your graph is a line. Now that we have the graph, how do we find the slope of this line?
Well, in order to find the slope, you have to see how many spaces you need to move left or right and how many spaces you need to move up and down.
Then the slope of this line will be -2/4, which will be -1/2. So who can tell me what is the y-intercept?
The y-intercept is 0, 1.
Right. So the y-intercept is the point where it crosses the y-axis. What we're going to do is going to put all of this information that we have just worked out in a table. Each group will get a graph to draw. And you will find out the same information, the description, the slope of the graph, as well as the intercept. And then we're going to start looking for patterns. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes for you to work on filling that out. What types of patterns do you notice with what we've completed here from 1A through 1D? Akela?
It's always a line.
Exactly. It's always a line. That's one pattern that we did notice. What is another pattern? Any other patterns that we've noticed? Lauren?
The slope is always the number with the x or the m.
Right. The slope is always the number. It's always the coefficient of this variable x. Any other patterns?
The y-intercept is always the other number or b.
Yes, the y-intercept is always b. So whenever we have an equation in the form of y is equal to mx plus b, we always know two things from that equation, because now we've known from looking at patterns, we can always see that. One, the slope m is always m, because it's the coefficient of that x. And two, the point of intersection with the y-axis or the y-intercept is always b. Okay, so now that we've looked at the patterns that happen in the table, and we know based on looking at the graphs, we can tell the description. We've looked at what the slope is, as well as the point of intersection with the y-axis. So we know M and we know B. Let's see if we can use the patterns, that repeated pattern that we see, to complete the rest of the table.